Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for risking life and limb by venturing into densely populated central London. I should say the outbreak is a problem for the Society, and we are not at all sure at the moment whether we will be able to deliver all of the lectures over the next few weeks and months that we have planned. We will keep you informed. It's not entirely in our own hands. It's not merely that the government will be giving advice and making suggestions, but venues themselves have their own concerns and may take the decisions out of our hands. We aim, if we can, to maintain the programme that we have already scheduled, but we will have to keep you posted week by week as this thing develops. Today we have James Crowden, who's also a long-standing member of the Society, who has had the kind of career that I wish I had the imagination to have, because he seems to have done everything that I would have liked to do and haven't. As he's already known to many of you, I will not spend much time introducing him, but he is talking to us today about a trip that he made to Ladakh in the 1970s, when it was a good deal harder to visit out-of-the-way places than it is now, when pretty much any travel agent on pretty much any high street can organise a trip for you to almost anywhere you want to go. James has, I don't know why it's taken him so long to turn it into a book. Perhaps he'll tell us that, but he has. It's a very nice-looking book as well, and you can buy copies over there if you feel so inspired at the end of the talk, or feel too embarrassed to leave without doing so. I'm going to hand over to James now to take over.
Thank you, Michael, and fantastic to see so many of you here. As I said, I have wonderful friends in the audience, including my old adjutant who told me to get my hair cut the other day. And, there are no avalanches in the Chilterns, so you've come here, which is good. Curiously enough, it is avalanches and snow which is the key, to me, one of the key indicators of global warming in Ladakh. I studied engineering, but I can see I was studying the effect of a road being built into a valley, but it wasn't just any valley, it was a completely closed valley system, Zangskari. Ladakh only opened in October 1974. One of my friends was actually in Kashmir at the time at the Tyndale Biscoe School. He went up there and said, look, you've just got to go to this place. And I was in the army thinking I'd been there for 30 years, but alas, I had to sort of resign my commission. But John, who's my adjutant here, said, well, we'll get you out quickly. He asked me to go back in again afterwards, but I was at Oxford. But never mind. It was a brave decision of his and mine, I think, in retrospect. Also, there are many people here. This particular picture is one taken from a mountain behind Padum, which is the main... it's now a town. It was a village then in Zangskari, which is a remote bit of Ladakh. And just to tell you how remote Ladakh was in people's minds then, I went to the RGS. They had a few books, but nothing. Drew, which was an 1870s book on the geology. There was Cunningham's book of Ladakh, which I found 1854, the same year to charge the Light Brigade. I went to the Alpine Club, found one copy right on a remote shelf, dusty, blew it. The pages had not even been cut. That is how well known Ladakh was at the time. It had been shut since basically 1947. In the audience, in fact, selling the books is a good friend of mine, Fiona, who came with me on reconnaissance in 1976. And it turns out the father of her friend had been a district commissioner DC in Leh in 1939, and his job, he said, was mainly to stop people sneaking into Tibet. But it was an interesting area. It was half under British. It wouldn't say rule at all. It was under the Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir. It was a slightly odd arrangement. It still is an odd arrangement. But luckily for Ladakh, they came under in 47, they came under the orbit of India, and it was touch and go as to whether there was immediate fighting. You cannot separate the sort of almost the Buddhist history from the military history in Ladakh, because It could have been communist. The Chinese could easily have taken it. They tried to in 1962. They got right down the Indus Valley and said, well, actually, we don't want this. What they wanted was a bit of the Aksai Chin to connect a road with Xinjiang. And there were 3 wars. In fact, if you include the 1999 the debacle at Kargil, there have been 4 wars with Pakistan. So when they talk about Mrs. Gandhi's emergency, it's absolutely nothing compared to what the Ladakhis had to go through. Anyway, this is the view from no mountaineering had been done there. I was with Eric Shipton in the RGS. I met him quite a few times before I left. He was fantastic because although you associate Eric Shipton with Everest and other adventures, he was Consul General in Kashgar twice. And one time he took the long journey. He went up from Kashmir to Leh on the old route. Then it took 6 or 7 weeks to get up to Kashgar, and he was very knowledgeable about Ladakh. And I even found a trader, Saeed Ali Shah in Leh in 1976, which is when I went out, who said, yes, Mr. Shipton, he used to stamp our passports in Kashgar. So he was well known, even in the street. And then, tragically, 3 months later, Eric died, but his last visit was to Bhutan. I went with my good friend Fiona from Bristol, and we did a whole reconnaissance of Zangskari. It was virtually nobody, very few Westerners had been there. There had been a ladies' expedition in 1955 or 56, I think. But they just came up from Manali and went back again. So politically, it was so sensitive with the border with either China or Ladakh, they wouldn't allow Westerners in. After the 71 war, it was a bit easier. It comes to which OP you've got at Kargil. That is actually the fundamental thing with Ladakh. It's control to the road. There was a rumour that the brigadier at Kargil, the Indian brigadier, would have his breakfast on his dak bungalow outside, and the Pakistani OP could see through his binoculars and report back to Islamabad what he was actually having for breakfast, which wasn't the sort of state of affairs they wanted. They then put in a big airstrike, relatively big, and some of the Ladakhis I knew actually charged uphill. They managed to take that OP, which then meant that that road was relatively safe, and the Pakistan border moved back a few kilometres. Only after that did they then decide 3 or 4 years later to actually open. They decided to open Ladakh, but it was during Mrs. Gandhi's emergency, so it's a strange thing, but it did happen. This is the view from the peak. There's a peak behind. We went in front of Eric Shipton, looked at the map, and he said, he didn't say anything for about two minutes. He looked at the map of Zangskari, and he said, none of those peaks have been climbed. He said, what you think, those points, they're only sort of spot heights for triangulation. They're not, the peaks are much, much higher. So he said, we had no idea that was there. He said, because they were always looking to the Karakoram, to K2 for climbing, or up the Baltoro and Saltoro, Mustaq. He said, we were always looking there and to Central Asia and to Tibet. Because they were slightly smaller. Nungkum was the only big peak there, relatively speaking. And that had actually only been climbed in 1913 and was only climbed in 1953. So these peaks, we were looking, this is the most extraordinary view, because we're looking south into Kishtwar. My friend Fiona took the picture, and we went up this mountain, minute one in Himalayan terms, only 18,500 feet, 18,600. But none of those peaks at that point had been climbed. You're looking into Kishtwar, and actually, I think Pete Baldwin was trying to climb 1 or 2 of them from the other side. So in mountaineering terms, it was not pristine, but it was a great privilege to be there, let alone all the anthropology I was made to do and to actually study the effect of a road going in. This is the old Bartholomew's map. It's the one I actually took with me, just to give you... Actually, I can't get a little pointer, but most of you will know it's right up in the top right-hand corner is Ladakh, which borders onto Xinjiang and what is technically Chinese-occupied Tibet, although I still call it Tibet. And the state of Ladakh, when it was a state, a country, it was enormous. It took up Western Tibet, it took up Honza, Gilgit, and it actually was fighting wars with Tibet itself. Everybody thinks the Buddhists are rather peaceful. In fact, they're not particularly peaceful if you go back in history. And Ladakh was aligned with Bhutan. They were aligned with the treaty, which is why they entered this war in 1660s. Anyway, there was a Treaty of Timosgang, 1685. It was more to do with Pashmina wool trade. Anyway, so that is... the irony is, the reason I put that up there is I had a taxi driver 2 years ago, sodding great four-wheel drive vehicle, from one of the most remote villages in Zangskari, Agshu, which actually has a real bear problem. The bears come in and take they take the milk, they take the butter. Anyway, Agshu, his money goes to support his 12-year-old son who's in a monastery in South India. My friend Ponsuk Dawa, his 5th daughter, who I didn't even know existed because she wasn't born then, she is now a nun. She was a nun in Bhutan. She's now married. So you think they're remote? Not at all. They are connected. When the Queen of Ladakh's daughter got married, there were a delegation from Mongolia. They are part of the old Central Asian Empire and trading empires, and also there was the trade route which went through Ladakh, which was very important. It was one of the main routes from China, from Kashgar, Khotan, and down from Xinjiang through there, and then it was easier, although it was a long way, from Leh was the staging point, and then down over. Kargil, some of you may know, is known as the town of 8 days, because it was this is the old trade route days, 8 days to Srinagar, or up from Srinagar, eight into Baltistan to Skardu, because Baltistan was part of Ladakh prior to 47, 8 days to Leh, and then 8 days to Zangskari. So that stages with horses, and I was very lucky when I first went into Zangskari with my friend Fiona. We tagged on the end of a caravan of 80 horses taking government salt in. And the road was being half built, but as an engineer, I wanted to study the effect of a road long term. That's one of the reasons that it took so long to write the book, was I wanted to see how a road changed a society, and it's quite profound. I'm still studying it, it's quite interesting. I was supposed to be doing a PhD at Oxford, but actually I realised 3 years was really not far too short a time to do this kind of study. And I'm still in touch with my tutor, who's in Kansas, and he's quite pleased. He's a very nice man, Skylar Jones, who used to run the Pitt Rivers. Right. This gives you some idea. This is just one of the many passes that you have to cross to get up. This is the main Zojila. I've got a stick. Here we go. I should have spotted this. Old style lecturing. Oh, where's that? I prefer the stick. Yes. Brilliant, thank you. This is the old route here. This is the old caravan route down below. This is what I call the army route. The Indian Army engineers were superb. They took tanks up there. They built the road to take tanks, which put the kibosh on the Pakistani army at the time. And they managed to come back into Kargil. Otherwise, the whole Ladakh would be in Pakistan. It was called Operation not Bucephalus, something like that. Anyway, they carried the tanks split down on mules up there. It was an extraordinary. The problem with this is, I talked about avalanches. These are extremely avalanche-prone nullahs in spring, and I've actually been caught in a convoy myself, where you've got avalanches in front and avalanches behind, and you're trapped until they dig you out. The main problem with the trade route was there was a great demand for goods that were stored up in Leh during the winter to then come down for the first spring, and they would take enormous risks, and sometimes whole caravans were destroyed in avalanches, and even army convoys have been. When you go the circuitous route up, you look down, you see quite a large number of vehicles at the bottom. So even going up there, the best place to ride on a truck is actually on top above the cab, and you feel like you're flying when you go there. And there's only there's a telegraph pole somewhere. There's one line. That's the only telecommunications into Ladakh at that time. There's quite a strong and interesting Muslim population in Ladakh. This man had just come back from Hajj, and in fact I was on a lorry load of some of the Muslims who'd just come back from Hajj, and they were coming back in. They're Baltis, really, the Balti. Some are Shia, some are Sunni. In Ladakh, in Zangskari, they were actually Sunni. In the main bit of the Saroo Valley, they were Shia, although at one village, Panikar, they were Sunni. So there was a slight. But all this area was Buddhist. You go back 500 years, it was actually Buddhist, and there are tall, 20-metre-high statues of Buddhas in this valley, as there are in Baltistan. This is the small village of Panikar. An English army officer ended up there. He died of fever in 1896. Herbert W. Christian from Bytonwood, Alresford, in Hampshire, and he was on hunting duties. But Nun Kun is just this whole village is dominated by Nun Kun. And some of you may know your Everest expedition, early Everest expeditions. The man who led some of those actually was the first man to take Gurkhas up onto Nun Kun. He was trying them out in 1896 to see how they would fare with snow and ice, and they fared extremely well. So basically all the early the Gurkha or Sherpa and then became Sherpa influence on mountaineering was from this village and up onto Nun Kun itself. That was the roadhead. This is just a very primitive map of Zangskari. That is the village I was talking about, Panikar. This is Nun Kun. This is Orangdong, the first Buddhist monastery we come to, and then this is all the Pensei La. It's a very low pass by Himalayan terms, only 14,500 feet. And then you come down into the central valley of Padum here. This is the main Himalayan range. You have to think, it's not just the Himalaya, it's not one range, but about 5 or 6. There's the Pir Panjal, there's the Dalada, the Pir Panjal, the main Himalayan range, then the Zangskari range, and then the Ladakh range, and then the Karakoram. What the Zangskari River does, which is extraordinary, is it cuts through one of these main mountain ranges here from Padum. That's where I spent nearly a year. Half the time, or some of the time, was in Kasia. In the first reconnaissance, we walked out right down this way, right down into Dacha, which is it's about 250 miles in all. And then this is the main route of the river. Zangla is an interesting village. There's a king of Zangla and a king of Padum. And then the river goes through a whole gorge. And it was the one line in a book from the 1870s by Drew saying the ice is so strong, the winter is so harsh that it makes a road of the ice. And this was what I wanted to visit. Leh is the capital there, and this is the trading route for butter in winter. And it struck me that it would be very interesting to see how people survive. There was virtually no information at all on the winters in Zangskari. They have much more snow than up in Leh on the main Indus Valley. These passes they're shut for 6 or 7 months of the year, so once the snow comes, you are stuck in there. And you cannot move easily. But there's 10,000 people in there, 8,000 probably now, then to 10,000. Some of the monasteries have 100 monks, Kasia has 100. And so the whole valley is cut off. And I thought this was an interesting thing to study, and so did my tutor at Oxford. This is what happens after harvest, just before the snows come down. There's a long time. I wanted to see how rivers froze up, and the answer is they froze up with some difficulty. When you've got your harvest, you have to get your grain in. You have to grind your grain while you can still use your little water mills. Anyone's been up to the Hebrides, you'll know there are Norse mills, almost identical form of mills. And these irrigation channels actually freeze up quite quickly. So if you don't get your corn ground, you then have to do it by hand, which they do as a quern. So it's a race against time after the harvest. This is the main Saroo river, and what is interesting was that rivers just are rather complex. In fact, they're very complex. And it was a whole system of 2 or 3 months of the river freezing, breaking. If there's several days of snow, several days of sunshine, the snow melts and then the river level will go up 24 hours later. So the ice it's already formed will break as the water level rises. If there's a lot of cloud, then the river level will drop. That ice will then break as well. So it's a long series of breaking, forming, reforming, and not all the rivers actually do form ice that you can walk on. This was less so. This gives you some idea. Let's see if I can use this device now. There we are. There is the peak of Nun. This is Nun and Kun. That's at 23,000. This is at 11. So this is the small little caravan I had going back in. Not 100 horses, 80 horses or 90, but only 4 horses. But that was all my belongings going in for 6 months. In fact, a year, really. And I took quite a few books, which is interesting. So the mountain is... it is an interesting mountain. There are many massifs there. This is Kun, the other part of the mountain taken from 25 miles away. And here there's a little sort of shieling which they had. Some of these were villages which had been retreated. So this was climbed in 1913 by an Italian team. And then there were the Nun wasn't climbed till 1953, which was by with a mixed French, including a very good woman climber who later died on one of the mountains in Tibet. She spent the war doing swimsuits in Montpellier or something, or Marseille, that's right. She was a very interesting climber, Claude Cogan, interesting lady. Now, here we are, we're 2,000 or 3,000 feet higher up. This is a Buddhist yak herding house. It's much more prosperous. It's extraordinary. It's the reverse of what you would have thought. Actually, in the lower valley, which was the Muslim valley, to be honest, they're overpopulated. They're certainly overpopulated now, with polyandry and with very few fields. It's their yaks which are important, the butter, the trading of the butter, and the selling of the animals in the spring. both. They will trade them in spring one time, but mostly in the autumn when they go down. They're very wealthy. They've got better wood, better glass. All these things have to be imported. And when you realise that every pane of glass has to be brought in on a man's back, it is extraordinary. And they're going over, it's like 100... To get from Cargill to Padum was actually 234 kilometres, because the engineers had actually, every kilometre, they'd sprayed a rock, even though the road wasn't built. So you knew exactly where you were, which always helped. This is at Rangdong, which is where 4 or 5 valleys meet. It is extraordinary. There's a monastery there. And this effect on the ground is interesting. This is actually ice. It's a very good place for wildfowl in the summer. A lot of nesting wading birds are there. And obviously the level had dropped, and suddenly there was a very cold wind, and this whole lot just froze into ice ripples, a bit like sastrugi, which is actually the technical term for it. I think it's a Russian term, actually. This is an interesting picture, road building. The road was not built with machines, as you might suppose. It was built literally. They said, Mr. Butt, the engineer, said, all is pick and shovel, sir, all is pick and shovel, and he meant it. And these are the older men. The younger men were off trading, or they had jobs in the army. They were quite very enterprising. But the men, they were working. So each headman of the village would get a stretch of road to do. And there were gangs of women gangs as well. The women were doing quite well. I thought it was extremely unfair. The women only got paid 12 rupees a day, but the men got paid 15. And I think the women actually were much younger and worked much harder. And sometimes you'd have this wonderful effect. You'd be going down, and you suddenly hear this singing up on the hillside. You see a gang of 15 or 20 women shoveling away on some bit of the road. But cash, the economy was changing from a cashless to a cash economy, and it was still, everything was in flux. Money was not really understood. One of the old ladies, you gave her a 5 rupee note. She got on money. She actually used it to light her fire with. These things happen. This is inside. I don't know if you can see. My friend Ponsok Dawa, who was actually, his father was the Raja, or the Gelpo of Padum. It's a long story how he got there, but this is very basic living. This is a homemade barrel with chang and butter on the top. This is chang here. This is actually his sister-in-law. This is the family. His mother is there. Her brother was a great meditator. I only found that out afterwards from Sheila. The family, he had 4 or 5. He had 3 children then. He's now got 5. But he'd lost one, so he counted the one that he'd lost to measles. Measles was swept through the valley every so often. He was a teacher. This is quite an interesting photograph, because you've got a bit of a... This was when he did his teacher training down in Kashmir in 1965. He bought himself a pressure cooker, and that makes all the difference to cook rice, anything like that. He uses less fuel, pressure cooker. This is an old Tibetan teapot here. And this is a stove made out of bakari, made out of Indian Army jerry cans. So the Indian Army is praised because the jerry cans are so useful. Once you split them open, you can build anything with them. The first snow came down, and that was interesting. This is actually across. This is the Monastery of Kasia with over 100 monks in. There's a nunnery. It was just started there by a nun who'd been in Tibet. The more I found out about some of the older monks, a lot of them had been caught in Tibet itself in 1959, only just got out with their lives. The next door neighbour in Padum, his grandfather was in Lhasa. He walked to Lhasa 3 times in his life, and on the last time he was actually buying the whole Kangya, which is Tibetan scriptures. I think it cost 8 yaks, but that's how you trade them. But he had to flee for his life in the middle of the night, and he had to leave that behind. And there was a Nawang Tapas, another monk who lived in that village. He helped these nuns set up. There are quite a few nunneries now. This is an interesting photograph. It's the very first fall of snow, and you can see the irrigation patterns in the fields. And I remember I mentioned avalanches. It is actually the depth of snow in the winter, which is what they need on the mountains to ensure the irrigation for the summer crops. 2 years ago, I went to Kasia, and I couldn't understand it. The fields were bare. I said, they said 60% of the fields we have not planted this year because there isn't the water to irrigate them. And that, to me, is very serious. Other bits of the valley, they've still got plenty of water, but I don't think they fully realise that the tap will be turned off shortly. It is a serious thing. I lived in a little house. This is the next door house. A monk lived there temporarily. Sometimes he was there, sometimes he wasn't. Mud bricked. There was a palace up here. There was a king of Padum, had a palace 7 stories high, but it got demolished when the Dogras came in about 1839. that is Padum. That's a terminal moraine, so you live in a terminal moraine. The snow is quite interesting. Quite a lot of you, I'm sure, will probably understand there's the metamorphosis of snow. It's an interesting topic in itself. This also is what is behind often avalanches. It's the snow structure which is important. They have very little timber. All the timber, even this shovel, which is actually like a paddle, have been imported from the other side of the main Himalayan range. They would have come across. And this is a family. What they do is they brush the snow up into a pile. If they leave it there and the snow builds up to 3 or 4 or 5 feet, the roof will collapse, obviously, and it will also collapse once it melts. So what they do is something called sintering happens. They brush the snow into a pile, leave it for a few hours, the structure completely breaks down, and then they can shovel it off the roofs. And they have to do that every time there is a snowfall. This is the main mode of transport, a yak. Everything on there is indigenous. They were incredibly good at making things themselves. He's got his cloak, that'll all be woven in the valley. There's a bit of willow for this is the steering device. He has these jato, which are the homespun, they're sort of boots, but the bottom is just moccasins. That's what they use for going up and down the frozen river. And a little besom or small brush, and that's for when you go into a house, you actually brush the snow off you so that when you go in, it doesn't melt and then form. They understand how to travel in these climates. The yak, they had a very severe winter in 1956, and about 2,000 horses and yak died. The yak mostly survived, the horses didn't. It was a terrible time for them. But they make their clothes last. This is actually quite a well-to-do family, curiously enough. That's the daughter. That's the man who walked to Lhasa and back again 3 times, grandfather. And she's eating sampa. Now, anybody who's read about Tibet, Eric Shipton really rated sampa, and I rate it as well. It's superb stuff. It's ground down roasted barley, and you put dried peas in. You grind it down on one of those little runtaks, the machines, and it's all. Then you roast it. So actually, you can use it like a porridge, but you just need to add hot water, and you can just make it on the march. And it's a very quick, efficient way of actually getting food into yourself early. Oh, have I just missed one? Now, this gentleman, he was called Gombo. He's actually in his best kit. There must have been a festival on. But he was one of, there were 2 very, this is Kagyu. There are 2 different sorts of Buddhism. Well, there are at least 4 different main sorts of Buddhism. There's Sakya, Nyingma. This is actually Kagyu Drukpa. These are the monks who are connected to the monasteries of Bhutan and also to monastic teachers down in actually this would be down in Lahul. He spent many years training, and he also liked his beer, his chang, but he was a very revered teacher in Padum, and a friend of mine, John Crook, actually got to know him quite well, and he said to him, "Oh, you Westerners, you seem to know, you think you know something about Buddhism. Well, why do you keep talking? Why don't you just meditate, you know?" And then he just sort of kept, but he was a great character, and when I went back this last time, what I was able to do the last 2 years, which is extraordinary, is I was able to take all these pictures I took from 40 years ago, show them to the people thereabout, and this was just extraordinary because they had no idea of how they looked 40 years ago. And the men came out and said, "Well, he was my uncle," then started to tell me stories. So to me, the value of anthropology is actually the interactive bit, in that you're actually able, you can almost encourage them to you're recording what they think about their own culture, and that is one of the things that's fascinating. This is what is known, the women wear these paraks. They don't wear them now except for posh occasions. This was actually a festival, but they will be wearing them in the fields. This is a very fine parak, mostly with turquoise. These are little gold and silver, and they're little. Some of these are made out, they look like plastic, but in fact they're made out of red coral. This is a goat skin, and that'll be mostly, the parak will be, the woman will inherit it when she gets married. There were 2 nurses in the valley, Western medicine, as they call it, and they say, "But your doctors, Nim Hakim, only half doctors. Our Tibetan, you only study for 7 years. Our Tibetan doctors study for 14 years." That was another nurse. There was some rudimentary medicine. One story which is very nice is that my friend Ponsoktawa, who's a teacher, he was my main interpreter. He was down in the village I showed first, Panikar, and he met an interesting man who's still alive now, aged 90, John Ray, who ran the Tyndale Bisco School in Kashmir. And he met him there, and he said, what's the teaching like in Leh? And Phuntsok Dao said, in Padum, he said, well, it's not much good. The teachers ran away 2 years ago and haven't been back since. So he said, right, is your son, you've got your son's bright. He said, so he gave him a scholarship on the spot to his 12-year-old son. He then went down, studied at Tyndale Biscoe, then he went to medical college, and I'm in touch with him now, Sten's in Namgyal, and he's now the main doctor in Zangskari. So a chance meeting has led to some interesting developments. This is a most interesting man from Kasia. This is Phuntsok Dao's brother-in-law. He's Kasia Lompo. He's actually the equivalent of the Earl of Kasia. He's very learned. He's Tibetan. He's a historian. He's an astrologer. He's a teacher of Tibetan. He's a Amchi, Tibetan medicine, and that's his father as well. He's one of the most respected men in Ladakh, in Ladakh, but also, I should go back, wind the clock back a bit. We were talking about Afghanistan earlier on, and in fact, two of the people who unwittingly initiated research work into Zangskari, you may have heard of them, Moorcroft and Trebek and Moorcroft wrote a book. They were in Afghanistan in the 1820s. Prior to them, they died in Afghanistan, in fact. But prior to that, they were in Ladakh, and there was this very strange Hungarian wandering around called Csoma de Koros, who was a great linguist. He'd walked all the way from Hungary and was on he really had no money left at all, and he bumped into them in Dras. And he was obviously a very good linguist, so they said, well, why don't you go and learn Tibetan instead of hunting for the roots of the Hungarian language? So they actually managed to arrange the Honourable East India Company, as it was, a stipend for him, and he went to live in Zangskari in the 1820s, and he was the first man to spend a winter there. But nobody has spent a winter there since I decided to, which was curious. But it was his uncle, great-uncle on his mother's side, who actually taught this man. They knew about him a lot. They said, well, yes. They talked about it as if it was only yesterday, that Csoma de Koros, who had been there. And he's ended up doing the first Tibetan English dictionary, and he's a great sort of hero of Tibetan studies. Tragically, he wanted to go to Tibet. He got as far as Darjeeling and then died of malaria, which he contracted in the Sarai in 1842. So some people call Tibet, Ladakh, Little Tibet, but in fact, in terms of scholarship, they often call it the Greater Tibet, because a lot of the early teachers actually came from Ladakh, and some of the fantastic paintings are in Ladakh. My great-uncle, I think he even whispered in Professor Snellgrove's ear, you better go to Alchi quick, and he did. Then produced the first stuff. My great-uncle, Kenneth Codrington, had tried to get to Ladakh in 1942. It might as well have been 1842, but the avalanches stopped him going, so he lived down in Kent. So when I was based in Maidstone, I used to flit off down there at weekends and go and see him, and he gave me a lot of advice on Afghanistan and on... I went down the frozen river with Sonam Stopgiz. That's myself looking a bit, I don't want to say audacious, unclean is the word probably. There's Dorje Sering, his uncle. This is the Polyandrous family. There's the father. That's the wife. Dorje Sering was said virtually nothing, but when it came to weddings, he could recite hundreds, if not thousands, of verses of the Gesa, which is the Tibetan epic, and not just recite them. They would have a competition where the bridegroom's family would come and they'd ask him questions and he'd have to reply. So he was extremely learned. A lot of these monks, the Buddhist monks, they can remember vast tracts of the Buddhist scriptures that make our learning seem a little bit simplistic, perhaps. Now, I'll just take a little bit of water. The river, the first law you learn is it doesn't always freeze. This is the crossing of the main river between between Padum and Kasia, and I had to cross that river 30 times like that during the winter. They think nothing of it. That's before it gets really... The temperatures, by the way, were down to minus 30. I had two little greenhouse thermometers with me. They both worked. One got broken because the kid stole it, but it went down. If it was minus 20 outside, it'd be minus 10 in my room, and then if it was minus 30 outside, it'd be like minus 15. So you had to learn how to cope with that, but you could. This was very early in the morning. Just had to get up and go. A stick was vital. They were carrying really, really heavy packs. We're looking at sort of 20 kilos of butter. It was worth quite a lot of money to them. It was about the only way they could get cash at that time. They either sold animals in the autumn or you took butter, and the butter was one of the main trading things. And they then brought, probably half of it they spent on goods they needed and brought them back, then the other half was cash for the rest of the year. Down the river, these sites where I did a bit of ice climbing before I left in the army. Fantastic. That would have been a lovely ice climb, but there wasn't time to do it. And this is actually a monk from... some of these monasteries really are cut off. So Zangskari is... Leh is cut off, Ladakh is cut off from Kashmir. Zangskari is cut off from there, and some of the valleys in between, you can't move between some of the valleys. So some of these monasteries are cut off, doubly cut off in the main valley. And this is a monk from a very remote monastery carrying an enormous amount of butter. And often, like the tithes would be paid in this country in cider or something, they would pay their rents in butter often. Often avalanches were a problem down the river, because if you're down the river bottom, all the avalanches then pile into the bottom. So you had to be lucky not to be caught by one. Phuntsok Tawa's first wife died. He then remarried a lady whose husband had died in an avalanche. And you gradually hear all these, I wouldn't say horror stories, but they're just completely factual. I mean, you often get a group of 5 or 6 women going together to Kasia Monastery, then they will, for the festival, and they've died in an avalanche. So actually they decided to change the festival date to the summer. But when you start talking, or people fall down crevasses when they're doing the trade route over the main Himalayan range. But when the river's like that, it's fantastic. And you're looking at pure geology. I mean, that's 5,000 or 6,000, that's probably 4,000 to 5,000 feet there. It's a massive, and this is just going straight through on one of those main ranges there. It did get a bit cold. A haircut would not have gone amiss. I did have one, actually, and they said it made me look 10 years younger. This is... Sometimes you have to start climbing. There were several points where we'd have to go up like 50, 60, 70 feet along ledges and then down again. In fact, I wasn't even wearing mountaineering boots. I was wearing Norwegian cross-country ski boots, which were slightly flexible, because actually the great danger is having a proper mountaineering boot, because you have a plate in the bottom, which means you're much more likely to get frostbite, because you need that for when you're using the crampons. So climbing was not easy, and they were wearing... actually, there's the sort of boots there. They have some of them... Yes, they're just wearing their normal jato, which are just like little moccasins, really. So it was not easy. This is the main polo pitch in Leh, and that's the Leh Palace, which is 9 stories high, which was actually a forerunner of the Patala in Lhasa. It's earlier. So this is the main Central Asian trading town. In those days, Nubra was closed, Changtang was closed, a lot of the areas, it was only really Zangskari and the Central Indus Valley which were open. Going back, there had been a real problem, because there had been some really good sunshine while we were living it up in Leh, relatively speaking. We got bored after 3 days. The level of the river had gone up at least 6 inches, and probably a foot. And this meant the ice was incredibly dangerous, because they were only just able to make it. And quite a lot of the time, the river was flowing over the main ice. So we'd have to often cross it, and sometimes hundreds of yards at a time. We'd have to wade like this. They thought nothing of it. There's my friend Dorje Sering in front. Tashi Tanta there. These are the Padum men. But the problem was that the ice had formed very sharp ice crystals, needles, in between. So you've got the solid ice underneath, then you've got this ice needle crystal on top, and then the river's flowing through that as well. And you can see where the river has collapsed. So, but we had no option. You sleep in caves. We took no stoves, no tents, nothing. We just slept in caves like this. They have an interesting adaptation where they sleep on their knees. And there was an anthropologist who was very helpful to me, actually, called Prince Peter of Greece and Denmark, who actually wrote a book on polyandry. And I can't find it, but I've got a photograph of them sitting, 6 of them kneeling round a campfire. So when I did a talk at the RGS 40 years ago, a man wrote to me and said, well, this reminds him of the Maasai in Africa, because they would hear for lions. So if you've got 6 people kneeling down round a fire, their ears would cover every direction. And the same thing here, snow leopards. It was a way of protecting yourself. And if you're kneeling down, very little of you touches the earth if it's cold. So not much of your heat goes into the ground. And there'd be just enough firewood under rocks. We would gather firewood under rocks as we went. And you got to learn where the summer level was. And by the time, an hour before you stopped, everybody did it, you then had enough kindling to light a fire. Next morning, just enough there. So that was a 3-star cave. It was a good cave. Talking of caves, this is actually, I mentioned the Hungarian Csoma de Koros. This is actually the cave monastery where he stayed for a year. And it's a remarkable cave. The cave goes back, the monastery, the early temples go back, and there were some wonderful early deep red Tibetan paintings, rather like at Toling or at Saparang, which are on the Tibetan side. And there are some other ones. We couldn't get to Spiti in those days, but you can now in Tabo. There are equivalent paintings. It is a rich iconography, and if anybody has been to Ladakh, the paintings of Alchi are some of the paintings of Zangskari reputedly done by the same painter, which is Lotsawa Arinchen Zangpo. So I've been to there. In fact, last time I went there 2 years ago, we were just coming back down a path, and we heard one rock fell. That immediately makes you think, if it's winter, a rock can trigger an avalanche. We looked up, and there were about 5 or 6 ibex up there. Not far above us, but ibex are the one thing they hunt there, and they have an enormous relationship with the ibex. There are a lot of rock carvings of men hunting ibex with bows and arrows. I don't know if you can see, that says Nawang Tarpa. He is the man who is Geishis, which means he's like a doctor of philosophy, only studied for 25 years. He was the one who was also in Lhasa. He's one of the most intelligent. He was at Ganden and at Tashi Lumpo, and in fact he outsmarted most of the monks in Tibet, then came back and just became a humble monk teaching Buddhist dialectic teaching. He's a Gelugpa monk. He lived very simply, and he was very helpful when they were setting up the nunnery in Kasia. And even this paper, these are some of their scriptures. The Kangyur, I think, is 108 volumes, and the Tangyur, the commentaries, is 200 and something volumes. And these volumes are not bound as we would understand it, but this is on handmade paper that they make themselves. They actually have the ink and the wood blocks themselves, and a lot of them are commentaries, and they look at a lot of their history. There's supposedly a long history of Zangskar actually in Bhutan, but I haven't tracked it down yet. So it's a culture you felt. I was the one who was having to learn. In fact, that's probably why I've taken so long to write the book, because I felt I had to learn a lot more about their culture before I even dare put pen to paper. These fantastic festivals are superb. This is in winter, in February, and these dances it's like a visual representation. They go on for 2 days, and often there will be several different festivals during the year. This is a papier-mâché mask, a vast mask, and the monk actually sees through the mouth there. This represents Hushang, and there was this great debate with Kamala Sela, I think it was. They were debating the difference between the sort of Buddhist dialectics of the scriptures and then almost the Zen or Chan approach of actually just intuitive debate. Both sides thought they won, but this is going back to the 9th century, by the way. And Ladakh was actually where the legitimate line of Tibetan kings fled to, so they regard themselves as the original Tibetan kings, and none of these sort of upstarts. There's still debates between the history. This is some of the dancers, and it will go on in about -10 in the shade. It'll be -10 probably, but they are fantastic. The monks train for months on end. I went down, they said there were paintings in Kasia, and it was completely dark. I went in there, and in fact, you go down a little ladder, and it was a granary. This was used as a granary. It wasn't used as a monastic hall anymore, but there were some fantastic paintings here. This is probably from the 13th century. You can see they have now touched them up. A bit of the wall fell away, and damp was getting in, so there's more light in there now. But the quality of the painting is superb. And I said Alchi's in a class of its own, in fact. My great-uncle, Kenneth Codrington, had been tipped off by a very astute but little-known French archaeologist called Joseph Hakan, who ran the Musée Jimé. And he was in Afghanistan with him, and he tipped him off to go to Alchi. And this is one of my favourites. This is Vairocana. And this is very unusual. This is one of the 5 Dyani Buddhas. But these 2 faces on the side, it's almost as if you're looking at an Italian. It's like Giotto. To me, it was extraordinary. You very rarely see perspective in Tibetan painting, but here this is a very fine figure. It's about that size on the wall. But in total darkness, you go along with your torch, and you suddenly see this, and you realise you're seeing, it's a bit like sort of Lascaux, that you're seeing these incredible paintings. And then this is 2 months later, this will be in about March this time, and actually this is called Nyungnes. It's actually a fast. A lot of the women come down and they fast. They're really much more religious. They have to do all the hard work in the fields, like weeding and planting. The men help quite a bit at harvest time. But these are great tankas, 40-foot high tankas, which are then hauled up, and they will sort of meditate for 2 days in front of them. And it's an interesting... So there are many festivals, and you have to know almost which branch you're in. You get some idea of the scale. There's a monk there. These are enormous. And in fact, they had a fire in 1965, so they're still repairing these and making them. The mountains, I was very keen on mountaineering, and I did not just the one mountain. I got to about there on this mountain. There was a wall of rock. I met 2 German mountaineers. The Germans were quite keen on mountaineering, and I got on with them very well. We had to spend the night out there. This is just under 20,000 feet, but you can get some idea that to live there for a year under these mountains, most mountaineers go to a mountain, climb it, go home, show the pictures, that's it. But to actually live amongst the mountains for a year and study the people and become part of them, they were so generous, was absolutely fascinating. I did a lot of anthropological research, did a lot of agricultural research. This was then taken on by Bristol University. 2 friends there were lecturers. They were readers. One was John Crook, and another one Henry Osmaston. Henry Osmaston was a geologist, and he then took on my agricultural stuff, and they did a lot more. In fact, there's an enormous book called Himalayan Buddhist Villages all about this valley, which I contributed to, and so I almost sort of kick-started that. In fact, David Attenborough's son came on it, Robert, lovely man. He came. There was a great team of people there, including Tashi Rebgiz, who was the Tibetan. We often had Ladakhi interpreters. In fact, he's a Ladakhi philosopher, and he says, I don't know about these people in India, he says. They had the Buddhist teaching and they just threw it away, he said, He's quite interesting, Tashi. He's still alive, a bit deaf, aged. I skied out. Now, I often just say I skied out, but in fact that was one of the more interesting bits of the journey, where it took about a week to ski out. There was a lot of snow. Wolves and avalanches were part of that. It was a fascinating way to see the valley. And the people, this last stretch was, over the main pass, was interesting. And then the rivers break up. You have this great sort of, rather like I've been up in the Yukon, and my another great uncle gave me advice. He'd been a mounted policeman in the Yukon during the gold rush, and he said in Whitehorse they actually put a peg in the river and they place bets on when it's going to move. So it's almost like that here. And then it's summer again, and you get these high pastures, you get very good grazing, a lot of horses. The Ladakhi horses are good, the Zangskari horses are even better, and they said it was some of the only a Zangskari horse would carry you over the main Karakoram range. The importance of the trade route cannot be overemphasised, and often it was the people supplying the horses and the horsemen and the fodder, which was very important. And so Ladakh is a shadow of its former self, but the trade, instead of, is now the tourist trade, helps. And I think that has helped quite a few of the young men form, not careers, but certainly jobs in the valley. And I had this bizarre, 2 years ago, I was in a restaurant, there are now restaurants there, looking over the balcony, I heard this noise and smelt this rather odd smell of sort of tarmac. And they were tarmacking just half a mile, not even that, maybe a quarter of a mile of the main bit of the road in Padum. Padum is now, there's a town, a crossroads, so it was bizarre to see these sort of Indian tarmackers hard at work. And apparently when the Dalai Lama visited, when he visited there, it was only a week before we were there, suddenly their mobile phone signals were really, really good. But the moment he left, they turned the beam away. Been quite a bit of tension between the Buddhists and the Muslims for various reasons, but what was really nice was there was a hotel just outside Kargil, and the Muslim owner was proudly showing us all the pictures of the Dalai Lama, who'd stayed there literally only 2 days beforehand, but he'd been told to take them down off his website, So it's a problem. And I think I'll call it a day there. I can rattle on for hours, but I would like to hear your questions, I think, or to answer any events that might have cropped up in your mind. So there we are. It's rattling through it, I'm afraid, but hopefully it's been of some interest.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. I said at the beginning that I suspected you had the sort of life I wish I had had, and I proved it, really.
You can take up sheep shearing now in old age. Sorry, in middle age.
Let's, questions?
Yes, here.
Right.
Chris, really, but I'm always intrigued when I hear or read books by people like yourself. You were in this valley for a year with interpreters. Is it very isolating, or should you presumably...
I loved it. No, I didn't want to come back.
How did you interact with ordinary people?
Oh, I became part of them. I mean, part of their life. I mean, they just treated me like, part of the extended family. They'd invite me in for meals, or I couldn't repay my hospitality very much, but I had this decision. The Ladakhi is very different. It's quite different to Tibetan. There's a lot of things. There were no books on it, and even the only books on Tibetan were in the 1870s. So for me to have learned, I'm not a linguist, but to have learned, there were two key people there who did speak reasonably good English. I was incredibly lucky. And they were often getting me to teach them more English. It seemed almost that was better, more useful to them in the long run, which it so proved, because then Bonsuk Dawa's son then was able to learn in English at Tyndale Biscoe, then did a medical degree. I didn't find it isolating at all. I found them very welcoming. And I often found, even in the Hindu Kush, it was, it's a little bit different in the Kafiristan. I did a previous journey there where we got snowed in on one of the last passes. So, but not isolating at all. In fact, the culture shock was coming back. For me, I went straight into Oxford, and I did something really weird. I was in a small village. I only got back, it was like a week later, I had to go into Oxford and Pitt Rivers, and I found this cottage, and I'd forgotten about electric kettles. I didn't know about electric kettles. I'd forgotten. So I filled this kettle up with water, put it on the gas stove, and wondered why there was a smell of burning rubber. It's amazing how quickly your so-called civilization. So you very quickly, and I couldn't sleep outside. I couldn't sleep indoors. I was much happier on the ground. You very quickly lose all your sort of creature comforts. So no, it wasn't isolating at all. In fact, I was. They go up to some of the chap, and I go back now. A chap came up to me and said, "Oh, I remember you. You put on weight, haven't you?"
One thing that's always intrigued me about the mountain communities is that they have wonderful hats and wonderful coats and things, but their footwear seems to be absolutely hopeless.
I think you're probably correct. Yes, they benefited very quickly from the Indian Army, and they were getting their sort of Indian Army sort of gash boots. But then their Jatto was just like moccasins, which was fine for the summer, but they kept wearing out, and on the ice they kept slipping over. Now, one of the men I pointed out, Tashi Tanta, I went back to see him, and he was always falling over because he had a massive pack, and he had a little kettle strapped to the top so you could hear him coming. And I'd always have to help him up when he tripped on the ice. And it was sort of tragic. He's now died, but the last time I saw him, he had a bad knee and he couldn't get up, so I was having to pull him up as well. But you're quite right, the footwear was never good because they don't have that sort of, the sole, the hobnails, they don't have the nails. You have to have really thick. I mean, we've been... even the footwear in this country probably wasn't that good. You had to be quite wealthy to afford good footwear, say, even in sort of Tudor times. But we often had wooden patterns, wasn't it? There's like the clogs, but they don't even have the wood for that. So wooden, they could do with leather. You could actually have like, you could make like clogs, but they just don't have the wood to do that. So you're quite right. I think it's they're often, that's the first thing they want is decent. They wanted puffer duvet jackets, and they wanted boots to wear. So footwear is vital, as I said before, so you don't get frostbite. They also, by the way, have much better circulation. At Oxford, there was this chap, Professor Harrison, I think he's died now, he's Professor of Biological Anthropology, and they wanted to do some research to look at how the blood flow through their peripheries, through the fingers and ears, and also to test their lungs. They got much better, is to do with, in their blood, is much better at processing the high altitude. There are many adaptations, and I think there are other genetic adaptations with Tibetan people. And they live mostly off barley, which Eric Shipton quite rightly said is damn good stuff. I think there's an opening there for the organic food movement. Yeah.
James, on the cover of your book, your marvellous book, there's a picture of a bird.
Ah, yes.
I had expected to hear something about the birds of the Himalaya.
Right. The birds of the Himalaya, yes, not the polyandrous ones. The bar-headed goose this was the icon which I didn't say it, but the guy who was doing the book cover did. I never met him. I talked to him a little bit by email, but when we went up, when the mountain with Fiona, we saw one. I'd heard about the Geese Migrations because they will fly some of the highest flying migrations in the world. I think even one or two early climbers on Everest said they'd seen them up there, and I saw a goose mark at 18,000, but they must have come over. There are no easy ways round the Himalaya. You have to fly over and then come down. They leave at night to get the thermals. So the British Raj probably killed a lot of them with their sort of punt guns and wildfowling in the 20s and 30s, particularly at places like Bharatpur, which are now obviously the camp, they're sort of wildlife parks. But they would take off and then they would fly and they would appear, and they often nest beside these high-altitude Tibetan lakes. And as I was skiing out, the last time I was skiing out, there was one just, it was absolutely knackered. I could almost tell. It was just flying alongside me, so it was my companion for a short bit of the way. But the trouble was they were all going up into Tibet, and the Chinese army were either nicking the eggs or a lot of them, they had a hard time. I have seen them in Ladakh. I went with John Crook, who was great friends with Salim Ali, who's a great ornithologist and Salim Ali's books. There were a lot of good bird expeditions. There was Fiona, who's here, her father was on an expedition to southeast Tibet in 1936 with Ludlow and Sheriff. Ludlow ended up as DC in Leh, and he spent most of his time doing bird research. So the early papers of Ladakh are by Ludlow. Southampton University did some. There's been quite a lot of the studies of the migrations. It's an interesting subject. Mostly the Zangskari they're passing through, but some of the bar-headed geese do nest there, but they usually nest up in like Solmariri or into Tibet itself. What amazed me is the sparrows spend the winter there. The choughs are superb. They rely entirely on the monks. The monks, we have the grain, the chang, it's all interrelated. They use the barley to make the beer. Then the spent grains are either fed to the cattle, the ones you're keeping for the winter, or they dry it on sort of yak hair blankets, and then the choughs come down to eat from the hand of the monks. I've seen that, and they're superb flyers. And being Tibetans, or Ladakhi Tibetans, they say, well, the red-beaked choughs go to the Kagyu monasteries and the yellow ones go to the Gelugpa monasteries. Yeah.
Rivers, any fish in the river?
Oh, yes. You've asked a very difficult question there, in the sense that the Buddhists don't fish. Our Muslim brothers fish with dynamite. And I have seen things happen. The main point of controversy, I mean, one lovely Muslim I know, he actually shot a bar-headed goose at Sunny Lake, which is one of the holiest lakes in Zangskari. That was not good. The other thing, and my landlord's son, I stayed some of the time in a Muslim house. I wanted to understand how a Muslim house worked and how a Buddhist household worked. They're quite different. But he appeared one day with bruises on his face, and I said, "What happened to you?" It's like a soldier who said, "Well, I met up with a bit of 4x2, sir." Actually, I saw an event which is exactly what happened. They would walk 3 or 4 miles to a bit of, because I can say this because I actually saw it happen. We heard this explosion, 2 explosions, and I looked down from Kasia, and there were men running away, and they'd been fishing in what technically are holy waters. There was a kilometre of river, which is supposed to be, and they deliberately walked 5 or 6 miles to go and put explosives in there. The monks jumped on a horse, rode down there, and they actually, one time they beat the chap up. Another time I saw the man come back in, and they would only hand him over in front of the police because he had a bag full of explosives and deck cord, and they would say he was up to no good, as they say. But actually they're related. This is the strange thing. A lot of the Buddhist women, sometimes they will change religions. So these families, actually, they was having a perfectly good meal with his Buddhist relatives, in inverted commas. So a lot of it was done for show, but fishing is one of those topics which we have to sort of skirt around sometimes. Anyway, interesting question. So you ask one question, you get another take. Yes, John.
It seems that, the population wasn't very big. Were there problems with sort of everyone marrying their cousin?
Well, yes and no. What is fascinating is that the Buddhist Polyandry, and this is where Prince Peter's book's quite interesting. My friend John Crook is last to know with us. He went back. He studied. Prince Peter studied 6 polyandrous families in Leh, and actually John Crook went back and studied them 40 years later. And polyandry, where one woman has usually it's fraternal, 2 husbands, actually keeps the population right down. That's how Tibet has survived. And so you have two ethnic, religious groups in one village, where one is trying to sort of, they realise that to survive agriculturally, they have to limit the population, so they do it that way. And the Muslims are actually, because they're now government jobs, they can actually get a salary, and so they can buy in more grain. The government was pushing It's a strange sort of, the socio-economics of it are interesting, and the political dimensions are also interesting, that these caravans, since the bad winter of 1956, the government took it upon themselves to actually have caravans stockpiling some food, not much, but some food, to avoid total disaster in Zangskari. So, because there's now a much freer economy with the road coming through, a second road has now just been completed from Manali. Often they would survive, some of the younger men and women who weren't married would actually go out of the valley for the winter, get jobs in Manali, and that is where the road is now through. And they had this bizarre scene I saw of an interesting, very interesting lady with her children. She was trying to get them to school on the other side of the main Himalayan range, and they're going to take horses up, phone for a mobile to get a taxi to come up the other side. So they weren't necessarily marrying their cousins, but they were well aware of who all their relations were, and often a lot of these, the marital relationships were economic in the sense that they would marry further up the valley, so there was an exchange of yak, of butter, the grain would go between the villages, and some of these very fragile, very ancient trade routes have now disappeared totally because of the road. So genetically it is interesting, and what is fascinating is that a lot of these Tibetans can trace their family history, like Phuntsuk Dawa, right back to the early kings of Tibet. When they become spiritually possessed, they're possessed by spirits from Lhasa and from eastern Tibet. So there's a whole bit I haven't touched upon, which is their La, their gods, their house gods, and the interrelatedness. So they will be, they're basically, they're marrying between old Tibetan clans. So yes, the kinship can be very fascinating and is well worthy of further study. No.
Thank you very much for a marvellous experience sharing with us. Could you please spell out the surname of the Hungarian linguist?
Csoma Koros. He's called Alexander Csoma, C-S-O-M-A, Da or De, Koros, K-O umlaut R-O umlaut S, Koros. Csoma Koros. He's made a bodhisattva in Japan. He's appeared on Hungarian stamps. And he's a great Hungarian. Some of the early Hungarian scholars, I mean, not that early, but I would meet them here at meetings at SOAS, and they were, they make a lot of him. Quite rightly, he's a great hero. And then there was another missionary, the Yashke, he was down in Keelong. He then carried on the Tibetan dictionary, and there's been a history of Moravian missionaries also studying Ladakh and Tibet. And you can get that online, that dictionary's online, which is very useful.
Did he publish anything else?
No, go on.
Did he?
Apart from the dictionary?
No, sadly. This is one of the things, it's one of the reasons I went, was he left. I would love to have, if he talked about what it was like in the winter, but he lived in a small room, which I've seen, which was my room was 15 foot by 6 foot or 8 foot. His was about half the size. And he had spent one time in Zangla, put up by the king of Zangla. His family are still there. You can still see the house. You can see the room he lived in. It's very small. And then he lived, Sangye Phuntsok was the monk that he was being tutored by, as it were, who was actually the Amchi, so the king of Ladakh. And then he lived in that monastery in the cave, which is Puktal. That's where he lived. So he lived very, very simply, living off £30 a year. He had no children. So he sadly left so I felt like it was worth trying to fill in some of the gaps of what it was really like to survive there. So he was an interesting man. As far as we know, he left no children.
Can I just ask you, there's a number of small monasteries you've talked about. Do any of these monasteries have old manuscripts or artefacts?
Oh yes, they do.
Is opening up, is that going to be under threat?
Well, it's been open for a long time now. How can I put this? I was once on a bus, I think it was a year later, and there was this very sort of, anyway, so we say it's an old German who boasted that he funded his lifestyle by smuggling tankas out. And I thought, this is not right. And statues, I think quite a lot of statues have disappeared. Small statues, some of them are solid gold. The problem was, historically, it's always been a problem. Ladakh was always wealthy, not because of not so much because of its agriculture, but in fact the trade route and the taxes on the trade route, they built up a lot of wealth. And when the Mongols went through, they took what they could, and the Moguls took what they could. There have been so many. You thought it's the most remarkable high-altitude agriculture in the world. You'd have thought, why do people want? They wanted to possess it. Virtually all the neighbouring countries have tried to invade. Even Kishtwar, Zangskari for one time was part of Kishtwar, another time it was part of Manali. So everybody's, because all their wealth goes into the monasteries, people then think it's worth, they can basically nick what they can from the monasteries. Ponsuk Dawa, for instance, his family, in 1947, when the Pakistani army came in, he had to flee for his life. He was a small child with his father. When they came back, their whole house had been completely lost. Everything, all their little statues had disappeared. And their neighbours, there's a continual story there of wealth being built up. And you'd have thought, what is amazing is that at this highest altitude possible, they're growing wheat at 12,500, barley at 14,000. How can they support a population of monks? But they can. It's through trade. I mean, they are just very astute, shall we say. So yes, there are manuscripts, and they are treasured, but they may not. There's a slight resistance in the Indian Archaeological Service of actually wanting to restore the paintings. They want to do it their way, and there's been quite a lot of controversy. It's a political thing as well. So you may be safer with manuscripts, but there are one or two people in Oxford who are keen on manuscripts. Yeah. Right. Yep. Then back to Kim.
James, I think I might be saying you're a Morton man.
Yes, that is correct.
Right. My question arises because listening to your fascinating talk, it struck me that it was a kind of high-altitude version of the travels of another great Morton.
Yes. I know who you're talking about. Yes, I did see him. I've saved all that for when I do the Afghan talk. I say because I went to see him, got to know him quite well. So yes.
Right, because you both seek out people in remote places, live among them, and then come back and tell fascinating stories. And I wonder whether it's something. I'm also a Morton man.
I thought you might.
Something about the water in Morton.
I don't know. It must be the deer. I think it's something to do with the deer. When I went to see, what struck me as absolutely extraordinary was there's a certain street in Chelsea called Tite Street. 15 Shelley Court was where Wilfrid lived. 200 yards down the road in the basement was where Eric Shipton lived, with his girlfriend Phyllis Wynne. So I would see both of them. Like sort of just, one was in his sort of Eagles area, the other one was in his sort of cave down there. But Thesiger was absolutely extraordinary. I went to see him in 1974 before I went to, I think Skylar Jones at Rivers had put me on to him. No, Peter Steele, a friend of mine in the Yukon. And he said, oh, God's sake, don't take petrol. He said, don't take a stove. We're talking about walking over the Hindu Kush, which I did. He said, horrible, messy stuff, don't bother to take it. And he basically... he got the maps out and he said, yeah, we'll go there, And then after I showed him, or explained where he'd been in Ladakh, he then went to Ladakh afterwards. But he was extremely helpful. Yes, I agree. I didn't shoot up enemy convoys of petrol tankers or do other things that he did. But yes, he was an interesting man and I had enormous respect for him. So I don't know whether it's the water or just you're slightly on the edge of things there. Mind you, I did ask him what the strangest thing he'd done was, and he said, oh, when I was 10, I think he was 10, no, was he 6? No, he must have been 6, he was born 1910. Down in Yemen, there were some troops, they were trying to fight the Turks. He said, 1960, they put on a whole barrage for me, artillery barrage. Then I asked the same question to Eric Shipton. You'd have thought of all the things. He said, actually, the thing he loved most was the walk from Leh to Kashgar for 7 weeks. He just said it was absolutely magic. Just being in that rhythm of a caravan for 7 weeks. So he was a very, very interesting man, Eric. Lunch is beckoning, I think. Oh, Kate.
It was to do with the coral in the headrest and where that might have been brought.
Well, I think it's prehistoric coral. It comes from Tibet. There was a lot of trade of semi-precious stones, shall we say, with Tibet. The cowrie shells would have come from Pakistan, what we now call Pakistan. So these things would be traded, the turquoise, the lapis sometimes. A lot of lapis. When I was in Afghanistan, I walked past the famous lapis lazuli mine at Sarisan, which is a very interesting place. So these stones, so the women were wearing the wealth of the family, as often happens. It's either that or acres, isn't it? Yes. I think we'd better, those who want to join us, some of us are having lunch in the remote bit of the RA, which is the Senate room. If you want to join us there, as well to keep chatting. We've got a table for 12 of us, but I'm sure they will have some room, but we'll have to get there fairly smartish. And there are some books, if you would so like. Thank you.